Boker Tov.
Morning, Afrail Purim, everybody. Tremendous chus to be learning Torah on Purim in the morning, to combine the night and the day with Torah, bringing in the day. Purim is a time that we accepted the Torah even in darkness, even when we couldn't really see necessarily Hashem. So this is a tremendous chus to be able to be learning Torah and perhaps some of the more difficult parts of Torah on Purim morning. So let's go ahead with that. Amar. So the Mishnah had said that Rabbi Yeshua had said that he had heard that there was a distinction between Temuras Pesach, which could be brought, and Temuras Pesach, which cannot be brought. Again, a Korban Pesach that is not brought on the day of at the right time is going to be a Shalom. Mosar Pesach, if it's leftover Korban Pesach, meaning that it was dedicated as a Korban Pesach, but can't be brought because it was lost, and somebody brought a replacement, and so this leftover Pesach, which is now extra, would be a Mosar Pesach. Sometimes it can't be brought itself; it would have to be put out into pasture, and only then, when it gets a blemish, can you sell it and use the funds to buy a shalomim. And sometimes this carbon itself is going to be available. And Rabbi Akiva explained to Rabbi Yeshua that the distinction is whether the carbon itself that was available and valid as a Pesach, and you pushed it aside, you would duch it, you didn't bring it, you chose the other one over this. So for instance, this person had lost his Korban Pesach. So that's lamb A. And then he purchases lamb B and says, okay, this is going to be my new Korban Pesach. And then he finds lamb A. So he has A and B in front of him. Either of them would be valid as a Korban Pesach. And he chooses B. So therefore A was essentially pushed away by choosing the other one. It was available as a Korban Pesach and he chose not to use it. So that's considered a dichui, pushing it aside. And as such, it becomes invalid itself, and only the replacement carbon, and only once it goes into pasture and gets a blemish, can you buy a replacement for that with those funds as a shlom. That's basically the explanation Rabbi Akiva has, but we had one more point in the Mishnah, which was that the Mishnah is talking about Temuras Shlomim, Temuras Pesach. It's not even talking about that Pesach itself that you lost and now found again, but that you took another carbon at its side and you said, I'm transferring the Korban Pesach from lamb A onto lamb C, a third carbon that you're trying to bring, and that transfer is prohibited. You're not supposed to do it. And if you did it, now they are both a carbon. And so now you have a third Pesach, one that you brought as a Korban Pesach, one which you had dedicated as a Korban Pesach, lost. And when you found it, it's a Mosar Pesach, a leftover Pesach. And then the third one is a Temuras Pesach, a swap, a replacement of a Pesach, which would take on the powers of, or the Kedusha, the sanctification of the first lamb would go transfer onto that, but the first one remains. So the Mishnah had said that if after he shechted the Korban Pesach, the one he had lost the lamb A, he buys another one, lamb B, and he brings that as a Korban Pesach, and only after he brought the Korban Pesach using lamb B did he find lamb A and bring it back. So now that's a leftover Pesach. So then immediately I can bring that Pesach as a shalomim. Or at any point, I don't have to swap it out. I don't have to put it into pasture, sell it, and use the funds, because it was never pushed away. I was never duchay. Amar Rava. So Rava explained, both parts have to have been done after the shechting. He found the lamb lamb A after he had shechted lamb B as his Korban Pesach. And then he took lamb C and stood it next to it and transferred the Kedusha from the Pesach onto lamb C. So now lamb C is also going to be coming from the powers of a valid shlomim. As we said, if you find the lamb after you've already shechted the replacement lamb B, so now lamb C is coming from the power of a fully valid shlomim. Aval nimtza kodem shchita. But if he had found lamb A while lamb B was still alive and he hadn't brought it as a Korban Pesach, so now he has to choose: does he want to bring A or B, the original or the one that he had bought when A got lost? And then he chooses B, meaning A is now which was originally going to be the Korban Pesach, is not the Korban Pesach and is supposed to be a shlamim. However, it was nitche in a certain sense because he had pushed it aside. He had chosen B over A, and then so Rav is going to tell us the lamb A is essentially a kedusha dechuya, a kedusha that had been set aside. And so when you swap and you try and swap the lamb C, a third lamb, from the kedusha of lamb A, which has already been pushed aside, so even if the swap happens after lamb B is shechted as a Korban Pesach, at which point there is no need for another Korban Pesach, so lamb A would be a shlamim. It would be a shlamim in a sense because the Korban Pesach, any Mosar Pesach and leftover Korban Pesach is for to be brought as a shlamim. Nevertheless, it's not going to be valid. Aval nimtza koydem shchita. But if you found lamb A before shechting, vehemer bay, and then you swapped out acha shchita after you shechted lamb B as your Korban Pesach, and lamb A is now your leftover Pesach, which is a shlamim, and you're going to swap C for A. Just as lamb A cannot be brought herself as a Korban Pesach, you have to himself as a Korban Pesach. You have to swap it out and by putting it into pasture, letting it blemish, selling it, and using the funds for a shlamim. So to the temura, which is coming from the strength, from the kedusha of such a carbon which has already been pushed aside, it too cannot be brought itself as a shlamim. Rather, you have to put it into pasture, let it get a blemish, and use the funds for a shlamim. So essentially, Rava is saying that the temura, the swap of the Korban Mosar Pesach, it doesn't matter to us when we did that action. We're at the time that the swap was done, at the time that the owner tried to swap out a new lamb for the one which had been lost and found, even if that was done after the Pesach was already brought. So at this point, the temura, the swap animal, is essentially Mosar Pesach. It never could have been brought as a Korban Pesach, so it's just a shlamim. But since it's coming from a lamb that could have been a Korban Pesach because it was found prior to bringing B as the Korban Pesach, so he had A and B in front of him and could have chosen either, and he chose B over A. So A is essentially a kedusha dechuya, having been set aside. Therefore, the swap, which comes from that power, even though that happened after the Korban Pesach had been brought, that will be considered a kedusha dechuya and not be valid itself as a Korban Pesach, as a Korban shlamim. It would have to be put into pasture, get a blemish, sold, and then you bring it as a shlamim. Esav Abaye, and Abaye challenged Rava's assertion. We learned the Torah says that if somebody brings a korban shlamim from tzon, so in English there isn't really a term, but in Hebrew there's a term that is for the general class of small animals of sheep and goats, and that's tzon. And the Torah says im min tzon karbana, if of tzon is his korban. So that should be sufficient to tell us that we're talking about lambs and goats. And then after that, it says v'im izim, v'im ez, and if he's going to bring a goat. So that should tell us that prior to that, we were talking about lambs, because obviously there's only two categories in this category. There are two types of animals, and yet the Torah says if it's a lamb, which is superfluous. It didn't need to say that because as we said, there's only two possibilities, and afterwards it says im ez. So we would have assumed this was talking about a lamb, and yet the Torah is specific. So why did it say im keves? Matam lemar im keves. L'rabbis tmuras pesach acha pesach shakrev shlom. So the Brisa says that im keves, the im word, if you're going to bring a keves, is coming to tell you that if you have a swap of a korban pesach after Pesach, that it's brought as a shlom. Now, what's the case? What is this case where you have a swap of a korban pesach after Pesach? If we're going to say that the swap is talking about that of a lamb that was once a Pesach, and it was found after you shechted the original, the korban pesach. So you had, in our scenario, A, B, and C, you had lamb A, you had dedicated as a korban pesach and lost it. You had brought a replacement and brought it as a korban pesach, and after you've already shechted it as a korban pesach, B, as a korban pesach, you find A again. So that's the case. That's the case where you have a lamb left over after Pesach, and then Hamer Bay, and then you took another animal next to it and made a tumura to swap it onto C. So that C animal is coming from the lamb number C, number 3, is coming from the power of A, which was brought after a korban pesach. So it's a totally valid korban. So the acha shchita pshita. So in such a case, of course, it's going to be as a shlamim, because it's coming from a shlamim. It's actually not a Pesach anymore. It was originally a Pesach, but when you found it after you've already brought the korban Pesach, so you found something that's essentially a shlamim, because Mosar Pesach a shlamim. The leftover of a korban Pesach is a shlamim. So lama likra. Why would I need a pasuk to tell me that the swap is also going to be brought as a shlamim? El lav. So must be the case is talking about shenim tzedem shchita. That lamb A was found prior to bringing the korban pesach from lamb B, and you didn't bring lamb B yet as your korban pesach. Now you have lamb A and lamb B in front of you, and you chose B over A, so you're essentially setting A aside, which Rava had just said would invalidate A and make it that you couldn't bring A as a shlamim, and therefore C, which is a swap, a transfer from A, also would not be able to be brought as a shlamim itself. You'd have to put it into pasture and use its funds. And then he did a swap of it after shechting it, and therefore it's proof against the Rava. So Gemara says, look. So Rava responds and says, no. Oh, you found the lamb after shchita and after shechting B as your korban pesach, and lamb A is essentially just a shlamim, because that's all you have. You can't bring another korban pesach, and we know leftovers of a korban pesach is a shlamim. So what I need a pasuk for? You're right. We don't need a pasuk for that. That's not what the pasuk is coming for. We're just using the pasuk as a support, as a hint to this idea. But really, the pasuk is coming for something else. So what is the pasuk coming for when it says im kesev? If you brought a lamb as your shlamim, Tanya, it's coming for another teaching. Tanya, kesev l'rabis es pesach la'alya. When it says kesev, it's to tell you that the korban pesach is brought on the mizbeach itself, because in almost all korbanos that come from a lamb, it says that the tail goes on the mizbeach, but by korban pesach it doesn't say so, and so we need this extra teaching to tell us that just as the other lamb korbanos, this one too, the korban pesach has its tail goes on the mizbeach. It's of the parts that are burnt on the mizbeach. Kishoemer im kesef. So that's where kesef comes from. Im kesef. If you brought a kesef, the Rabbis Pesach Shavuot Shnasai to tell you that a carbon Pesach, which has to be brought in the first year of the lamb's life, and it turned one already, so it passed its birthday, and so it can't be brought as a Pesach, as well as Ushlamim Abba Machmas Pesach, and as well as any shlamim, which is brought on account of that it was once a Pesach, it was lost and then found, and it's leftover carbon Pesach, that you would be bringing it as a Pesach. We're on the fourth wide line. That it has all the rules of a shlamim. And generally, a shlamim offering has some rules that a carbon Pesach does not have. Shatan smicha, you have to lean on it. The owner would lean on it at the as carbon. Unesachim, and it requires the libations, which is wine and oil with the mincha. But tenufas chazav v'shok, and a shlamim also requires that the kohen is going to lift and wave the brisket and the thigh. So these are part of what's necessary in the shlamim that is brought as a Pesach that's brought as a shlamim, and that's what it tells you im kesev, that if you brought a kesev, meaning if it was once a Pesach and you bring it as a shlamim, then it has all the rules of a shlamim. And then a kishua omer, and then subsequently when the Torah says the imeis, if you bring it if you're bringing a goat, so that the imeis is separating it from the previous hifsik Indian, it's separating it limit al eish ein toinali, to tell you that by a goat, you don't require the tail to go on the mizbeach. By a lamb, we said that the extra teaching is there to tell you that a carbon Pesach that's brought needs its tail needs to go on the mizbeach as one of the parts that go on the mizbeach. That's not true in regards to the goat. The goat's tail, in as much as it has one, does not go on the mizbeach. Some have the same conversation between Abai and Rava in a slightly different form, but essentially the same idea. There's some that say that it's going on the beginning of the Mishnah. Where the Mishnah says the first halacha, that if you find a carbon Pesach and you find a lost carbon Pesach after you've already designated a second, prior to actually bringing your second lamb as your carbon Pesach. So now you have both of them in front of you, and you choose the second over the first. You're choosing lamb B over lamb A. So you're essentially pushing lamb A away. You can't bring lamb A as a shlamim because it was a carbon that was set aside. And so it has to go into a pasture, get a blemish, be sold, and the funds used as a carbon Pesach. And gets sold, and then with those funds, you're going to bring a shlamim offering, a peace offering. And also, if you had that lamb A after you brought B instead of A, and you then swap out A for try and transfer it onto C. So now C is going to have the same rules that you're not allowed to bring it as a carbon Pesach. Obviously, you already brought a carbon Pesach. You can't bring it itself as a shlamim because it's coming from the power of something that's been set aside. So you have to put it into pasture, let it get a blemish, sell it, and use the funds for a shlamim. Amar Rava, to that Rava said, that's only if not only did you find lamb A prior to shechting B as your carbon Pesach, but you also tried to transfer the power from A onto C before you shechted B. But if you found lamb A before you had shechted B as your carbon Pesach, and you chose B over A, And vehemer by achashrita, but you only transfer the power of the Tmura, trying to transfer the Kedusha of Lamb A onto C, onto the new carbon, after you had already shechted B. In such a case, Tmurasa Kreva Shlamim. There you can actually bring it as a Shlamim. So that's the change in this way, where he's going to say that in the case where you found the lamb before, the original lamb, before you brought the new carbon Pesach, but you try to swap it out only after, that there it actually is itself going to be a valid Shlamim. My time, what's the reason? Kika kava, shrita, midi lechazile lekava. The carbon Pesach, which was the original carbon Pesach, and it was set as a Pesach and then invalidated because you had not chosen it, is only what was available as a carbon Pesach. But the lamb number C, which you're now introducing as a swap to A, that happened after the carbon Pesach was already, your B was brought as a carbon Pesach, so it was never available to be a carbon Pesach, and so it's not going to be invalidated in this way. To which the Gemara says, Esevi Abai. So Abai challenged Rava, Im Kesef, from this teaching that we saw. If you're bringing a carbon, your shlamim from a lamb, so what do we need that to teach us? So we saw the Brisa says that this is talking about a swap of the carbon Pesach after you've already brought the carbon Pesach, that it's going to be a shlamim. Yochel aflefnei Pesach. And the Brisa says, and maybe this is true even before you brought the carbon Pesach, that a swap of the carbon Pesach of A, when A was found prior to bringing B as your carbon Pesach, that it can also be brought as shlamim. And now we're at the top of Tzadi Zayin, Amen Aleph, 97.8. Okay, Talmud Loimar, who, that's what it says, if you will say this is a carbon Pesach. Amartem zevach Pesach who karev ve'ein tmuras haPesach kreva. This can be brought as a carbon, but not something that's a swap of the carbon Pesach can be brought. Now, what's the case? If you found the original lamb before you shechted B in its place, and you had also swapped it out swap it out onto C before you shechted B as a carbon Pesach. So you now have 3 lambs in front of you that you've designated as a Pesach, the original, the one that you designated when you lost A, and then C, which you tried to swap A onto. And you're choosing B as your carbon Pesach, so they're all, the other 2 are both negated as your carbon Pesach because you didn't choose it. Of course, Lamali Kro, why do I need a pasuk to tell you that this is not going to be a valid carbon? It's a swap of a shlamim, right? It's a swap of a carbon Pesach that was designated now as a carbon Pesach, and you're now bringing it. So Lamali Kro, why do I need a pasuk? It must be that the case is that I found A while B was still around. And I chose B as my carbon Pesach, and A is my leftover Pesach. And then I swapped C with A, trying to take over the Kedusha of A onto C after Achashchita, even after the B was already shechted. But since it's coming from the power of an invalid carbon, where it itself cannot be a shlamim, so therefore C cannot be a shlamim. They both would have to go into the pasture, be sold off, and a shlamim brought for that to Yufta the Rava to Yufta. Indeed, this is a contradiction to Rava. I saw you had a question, John.
Yeah. So if I have the first one that either gets lost or I decide I want to replace it or whatever, it automatically becomes a shlamim, right?
Right.
So then why would I have to go and put it in the pasture and wait for it to get a mum and sell it and then take the money and buy another shlamim? Why can't I just use it?
So it itself becomes a shlamim because that's the only next thing I can do with it, because I can't bring 2 Pesachs, right? So it itself becomes a shlamim, but because I have both of them in front of me, the original Carbon Pesach and the new one that I brought, that I designated. So I lost 1 o'clock, I lost my lamb. 3 o'clock, I'm like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to run out of time. I bring B as my Carbon, I designate B as my Carbon Pesach, and now I find A. So I have two of them in front of me. By choosing B in that scenario, I've proactively pushed A, which is still valid as a Carbon Pesach at that point. I've proactively pushed it away. That's called Kedusha Dechuya. I've pushed aside its holiness. Now, obviously, I had to make a choice. But the fact that I did, while this was a valid and available Carbon Pesach, and I invalidated it as a Carbon Pesach, that making it into a shlamim invalidates this lamb. This cannot be brought as a carbon anymore. I can swap it out. I can put it into pasture, let it get a blemish, and then sell it and bring the monies for use the funds for a shlamim. But I can't bring this one itself because it's a kedusha dechuya. That's what this concept is. When you had it available as a Carbon Pesach and chose not to use it as a Carbon Pesach, that's a dechuya. That's pushed aside. If it had been lost, so it wasn't available as a Carbon Pesach, and I brought B as my Carbon Pesach, and then I find A, that's a Mosar Pesach. It itself can be brought as a shlamim because it was never invalidated actively. I never actively set it aside. It was lost, so it wasn't available as a Carbon Pesach. And by the time I found it again, I didn't need a Carbon Pesach anymore. In such a case, it's going to be valid.
But isn't that then pushing it to a lower level of kedusha, which I thought we don't do?
No, shlamim is the same level kedusha as a Pesach, so they're going to be equal. Once it gets a blemish, it's degraded itself. So that's why we put it into a pasture, let it wait until it gets a blemish, and then then it itself is degraded. So then I can sell it off and use the funds for a proper shlam.
Thanks.
That's the mechanism for that. Okay. So if you thought this previous Gemara was a little bit difficult and challenging, Shmuel is about to make it more exciting, and it's Purim, right? So we need to be able to focus real hard on some Gemara. So let's do this. Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel says, "Kol shebechatas mesa bepesach karev shlamim, kol shebechatas roya bepesach nami roya." Shmuel says a rule. Before we get to the details of the rule, just the rule itself, and especially since the rule is going to change, or the meaning of this statement is going to change. But at this point, what we take Shmuel's statement as on its surface, and here's what he says: anything that if this were a chatas, a sin, would have to be put down. It would have to be it would have to die. We couldn't even swap it out. Kol shebechatas mesa. So then, bepesach karev shlamim. In a Carbon Pesach, you can bring itself a shlamim. A leftover Pesach, you can bring it as a shlamim. V'chol shebechatas roya. However, if the rule by a chatas is that you don't put it down, you don't let it die, but rather you put it into pasture and let it get a blemish first, but Pesach also is going to have the same rule. As a Pesach, it's going to go into pasture and get a blemish, and then you're going to swap it out. So what are these scenarios? So there are 5 categories of a chatas, a sin offering, which you cannot bring it itself. It's an invalidated chatas, but it doesn't go into pasture, but rather you just have to put it down. You leave it for to die. This is Vlad chatas. If the chatas gave birth, so now the baby is also a chatas, but it's an unnecessary chatas because it was already in its mom as a chatas, which is being brought as the owner's sin offering. So this is a invalid chatas. Or tmuras chatas, if somebody tried to swap out a chatas, which also, as we saw before, you're not supposed to do that. And if you did, both are now kaddish. So this is an extra chatas. Or v'chatas shemeisa balel. The person A a person sinned and did something that is a punishable by kares, and did so inadvertently. So they bring a chatas offering, and this chatas offering is designated, and then they pass away. So now the sin offering that is designated but has not been brought has no owner, no person to atone for. So this is also a third case of a chatas that's invalid. It has no purpose anymore. Or if the owner had lost this animal that they had designated as a chatas, brought a different one in its place, and now they find the original. So this original is essentially useless. It has no purpose anymore. And since the first one was lost and refound after the owner already got an atonement by bringing a different one, so it's again a chatas that has no purpose, and it too is one of these 5 that would be put down. And the next one is she'avra shnasa. If the carbon became too old, so it hit its birthday, so it's no longer valid as a chatas. In those 5 cases, the chatas offering, mesa, it gets put down as left to die. It's not enough to just put it in a pasture and let it get a blemish and then trade it out. So in these 5 cases, the equivalent for these, the way we read Shmuel in his statement is these 5 cases that by a chatas, mesa, it's left to die. By a Pesach, you can actually bring that lamb itself as your shalomim offering, as a peace offering. However, in the case of a chatas, where it would go into pasture, which the Gemara is going to explain later what that case is. So then by the carbon Pesach, it also goes into pasture. Now me right. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, however, Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein ha-Pesach karev shlomim ela shenimtza ach hashchita. No, there's only one time that you can bring the carbon Pesach itself as a carbon Pesach, and it doesn't have to go into pasture, and then you bring a shlomim from the funds. Only if you find the original carbon Pesach after you've already shechted B as your Pesach lamb, and then you find A, so then it defaults to being a shlomim. But if you find A before you shechted B, it itself is always going to be a invalid carbon, and it has to go into pasture, blemish, the funds become a shlomim. So now Rav Yosef is going to challenge Shmuel. This that Shmuel said that whenever a chatas goes into pasture, a Pesach goes into pasture. What about a chatas that is that reached its birthday, where the chatas has to be a carbon in its first year, and it reached its first birthday, so now it's no longer valid as a chatas that goes into pasture to get a blemish, etc. And Damar Reb Shimon Melakish, because Reb Shimon Melakish says chatas sha'avar shnasa royina isa ki'ilu yamedes beis hakfaros, a chatas that reached its birthday. So it's like it's standing in a graveyard, meaning the kohen can't get it. So we just have to leave it where it is. V'royeh, and we let it pasture until it gets a blemish, and then we sell it off. V'ilu Pesach, but by carbon Pesach, ki hay gavna karev shlomim, but by carbon Pesach where it reached its first birthday, and so now it's an invalid carbon Pesach, it automatically defaults to becoming a shlomim. You don't have to send it into pasture. The Tanya, as we learned, Kesev l'rabes es Pesach la'alya, like we learned before, that it says lamb. From lamb, we learned that the tail goes on the mizbeach. Kishe'omer im kesev, and when it says, and if you brought a kesef to tell you rabes es Pesach shavar shnoser, to tell you that a Pesach after that turned, it hit its first birthday, and so it can't be a Pesach anymore, but it could be a shlamim, or shlamim by machmas a Pesach, or any leftover Pesach that's brought as a shlamim, l'chol mitzvah shlamim, that it has all the rules of a shlamim, meaning shetun and smicha, you have to lean on it, or nesachim, and it needs the libations. the wine and oil and the flour. Tenufa, schazav v'shoik, and you have to lift and wave the brisket and the thigh. So we see. So what we see is that you actually are going to bring a shlamim from a korban pesach that hit its birthday. Now the brisa continues, and we're just bringing the end of the brisa, and because we're to finish it up. Because im eis, and when it says, and if you're going to bring a goat, as we saw before, that's to tell you that to make a distinction that the goat's tail does not go on the mizbeach. In any case, what we see from this brisa is that the lamb that reached its birthday, the korban pesach that reached its birthday, defaults and becomes a shlamim. But you, Shmuel, said that that if by a chatas it goes into pasture, by Pesach it goes into pasture, and a chatas that reached its birthday goes into pasture according to Reish Lakish. And so the rule is not a solid rule. Amar Lei, the Gemara says, you're right. So the Gemara responds, Kika Amar Shmuel, when did Shmuel say his rule that he didn't mean all the categories of when it goes into pasture, it goes into by a chatas, it goes into pasture by shalom. He's talking about one, but avudin only if it got lost, but not in a case where it actually gets pushed aside, such as when it reaches birthday and it's now not available, even if it was in front of you. It's not available as a korban pesach. That's a dechuyin, and there he did not say his rule that if by chatas it goes into pasture, by pesach it goes into pasture. Va'avad mi mishkachasla. So now the Gemara says, even if the korban is lost, do you have a case that when it's lost, it goes into pasture? Now, what's the rule by a chatas that was lost, and he designated a replacement chatas, and then before he brings the replacement chatas as a sin offering, as an atonement, he finds the original. So in that case, the halacha is it goes into pasture. The Tanan, as we learned, Hifresh chatas v'avda. He designated his korban chatas, and he lost it. V'hifresh acheres achteh, and then he designates another chatas in its place. V'nimtzas harishona, and before he shechts the replacement, he finds the original. V'areshtein oimdas. And now he has in front of him his two designated chatas offerings. One of them is not going to be able to be brought. Achas mehanti karev v'shniya tamas. Divrei Rebbe. So Rebbe says one of them is brought as a korban pesach, korban chatas, as sin offering, and the other has to be left for dead. It's put down. V'chachamim say ein chatas mesa. No, it doesn't have to die. The only case that it has to die is when the owner already has an atonement. But this one was found before the owner had an atonement. This one was prior, and therefore it goes into pasture. So in the case where you found the original that is designated a chatas prior to actually bringing the replacement, so you had both in front of you. So in this case, the owner had not yet had his atonement. So in such a case, the chatas that was not chosen goes into pasture. It doesn't have to die. It could just go get a blemish, and then you use the funds for the next for the karbanos. V'ilu b'Pesach. However, by a Pesach, in this case, he loses the korban, his original lamb, finds it when he's designated a second already. So he has in front of him two lambs, one the original designated Pesach and one the new one. So he found it after it's already time for bringing the korban Pesach, but before he actually brought the korban Pesach. In such a case, korev shlamim, it can be brought as a shlamim. That's according to the Chachamim. So now your rule that Shmuel, you said that if by a carbon by a chatas it goes into pasture, by Pesach it also goes into pasture, doesn't seem to work. Shmuel Rebbe Tzvi. So Shmuel says you're right. I follow the opinion of Rebbe that in that case it doesn't go into pasture. That one dies. Dama avuda lamesa. That this the one that was lost is left for dead. Kol avuda Rebbe mesa. But that's true in anyone that's lost, according to Rebbe. According to Rebbe, any chatas that was lost, it automatically is left for dead. But by a Pesach, where you got lost before chatzos, meaning in the morning you lost it, and then you found it, you found it before the chatzos, before noon. Roya. So there it goes into pasture to get a blemish. So the Gemara says, Shmuel responds, no, that doesn't count. If you find it before noon, so that it's not even the time to bring your carbon Pesach yet, so it doesn't count as a lost carbon because it isn't the time yet. So it was never lost. The fact that you didn't know where it was at a time that it was irrelevant whether you knew or not because it's not able to be brought as a carbon, that's irrelevant. Rava, like Rava said, Rava Avedas Laila Lav Shma Aveda. Any animal that's lost at night as a carbon, you can't bring it as a carbon anyhow. So the fact that it was lost is of no consequence. So then it doesn't count as lost, and it goes into to pasture to get a blemish. So the Gemara says, well, then in what case? Yes, John, even though you've declared it as a Pesach, but the fact that you lost it didn't invalidate it because it wasn't the time for Pesach yet. So you couldn't bring it as a Pesach in any case. That you've designated it as a Pesach, but it isn't yet valid. It isn't yet of any consequence that you've lost it. That's the point. It is a Pesach, but it's of no consequence that you lost it. So in what case do we have that, according to Rebbe, that it goes into the pasture because of the loss? So now we turn to Tzadi Zayin Amid Aleph. Kira Rabbi Yeshaya. The case must be in the case of Rabbi Yeshaya. The Amar Rabbi Yeshaya. Rabbi Yeshaya said, somebody originally from the start, they had sinned and decided they're going to bring a sin offering as an atonement, but they weren't sure that one was good or it would die or whatever. So that is designated two. One is going to be the carbon, and the other is going to be from the start as an assurance policy. And Miskaper Ba'achas, he only has to use one, obviously. And then in that case, that second one goes into pasture. And the funds become a shlamim. The funds go to the mizbeach. Well, in such a case where it goes into pasture by chatas by a carbon pesach, if you designate two, one as your pesach and the other as an assurance policy, that's going to default and become that's going to by default become a shlamim, and it doesn't go into pasture. So again, your rule Shmuel doesn't work. Ela Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Svirle. So it must be that Shmuel follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And we'll end with this, and after Shabbos we'll complete the Daf Tzadi Zayin and explain what Shmuel is talking about. Wishing you all a happy Purim, festive Purim, and a wonderful Shabbos. Yeshakach for joining.
And happy birthday for Yaakov.
And happy birthday to Yaakov, indeed.